Hi, everybody. I wanted to take a moment to follow up on some questions that came in regarding today's webinar. Just as a quick reminder, we just did How Much Am I Worth, the summer 2022 edition. And we got an excellent multi-part question series. The first question being, prior to COVID, you indicated LAM salaries were already stagnant or declining. Why do you think this was happening? Do fast-growing technologies play a role? More specifically, using resources to pay for technology that can soon cancel out current jobs. So there's a few different things going on, and of course, this is just my opinion based on observation and assessments of both my experience and the research that I have done. So I'm sure that there are additional points of data and reasons as to why there has been a steady decline in value in LAM jobs, especially prior to COVID and then exacerbated with COVID. With that said, first and foremost, I think that for libraries, archives, and museums, people in LAM field, it is hard for people who are not in our field to, first of all, understand what it is that we do, and then to value it appropriately. If they have no idea, like the level of professionalization that we go through, the amount of education and training, the amount of critical thinking and special handling skills, or whichever your particular job role is, there unfortunately is not a lot of people in higher up positions, especially, or in like the HR department, that have any clue what it is that we do, and an accurate clue at least, and what it takes to be able to do what we do. And when they have no understanding of that, they also have no idea how to value what it is that we do. Worst case scenario, and unfortunately very common, is that they think just anybody can come in at a somewhat administrative, like secretary type level, entry level position, and just like create an inventory of an archives, for example, or just scan all of the things, or just put all of the museum objects up online, having no idea what sort of standards are involved, how a collections management system is supposed to work, the fact that collections have to be processed first before we can even catalog them, for the most part. So they just have no idea. Also, technology does play a role, of course, but not quite how anyone typically thinks that it does. Uh, in order to understand the majority of LAM jobs, and I would venture to say any of the LAM jobs, because that professionalization component is there and depends so much upon critical thinking, empathy, contextual linking, relationship building, even all of those elements that it takes to do our jobs well and meaningfully, you have to be a human still. We have yet to have technology that can do those things, certainly not effectively or instead of a human. What technology can do is help put collections online. It can help provide collections management, but you still need a human, at least one, to use the technology. And we'll get into technology again with one of the follow-up questions, but technology can't replace us. But again, going back to that first point, if nobody understands what it is that we do, it could be that they assume that just having the collections online is somehow taking care of like all of the other work that we do. So I don't think that in actuality, technology is actually taking away any of our jobs. In fact, I think it is compounding the amount of labor that all of us are having to do and increasing the amount of knowledge and skills that we need in order to do our jobs effectively with these technological tool advancements. I don't think they're taking our jobs. And in fact, if you are looking in adjacent fields that are more technology heavy, those jobs are actually paid better. So there may actually be more opportunity here than there is any detractors if we can actually link our professionalization and abilities with the use of advanced technology. Finally, for this particular one, being able to prioritize and articulate the value that we bring as humans is going to be critical here. And especially trying to explain it in a general language kind of way for people who don't typically work or speak about library, archives, or museums type work. So, learning how to articulate that in general language, being able to present it as the critical thinking, contextual linking, relationship building, all of those elements are things that we do every day. We may not think of it as that because it's just so inherent to our everyday lives and how we do that collection work, but it is worth reminding and even having in your position descriptions, making sure that these human skills are reflected in terms of what it is that you bring to the table. All right, my university higher-ups view the library as a blank space, and they want to fill the archives with everything historical they can think of. The amount of work already needed is to get the archives back in order is a lot, while working with a small to mostly absent budget to address more pressing needs and issues. So first of all, just an affirmation that unfortunately the situation that you are in is fairly common. This is certainly something that I hope we can address more systemically than we have been able to as a field. But that's all to say that unfortunately, if the higher ups aren't viewing you as a cost cost line on the budget, then they're also then trying to think of you as somewhere where they can get money back out or show where there is money. And so sometimes that means trying to stuff it full, in this case, the archives, of anything historical they can think of for essentially bragging rights. Sometimes it can be very silly. So that is fairly common, and compounded with that and fairly common is the fact that like you already have a job to do, you already have collections you are taking care of. Many of the collection centers across the country are already over full, so it's not like you have a lot of blank space actually to fill up. So I think there are a couple of things that we can do to help address this. One of it is, again, and unfortunately, around the misunderstanding of what it is to be a library or an archives or a museum. Sometimes the higher ups misunderstand it purposefully, or at least it certainly seems that way. So, some gentle education around those elements. And what can back that up is the following point, where having documentation to point to can be incredibly helpful. Even just the symbolism of having a collection policy and pointing to it in terms of why, no, we can't just take in that random historical thing that you happen to be super, like the higher up happens to be super into, that you have a collecting mission that you base your collecting acquisition decisions on. You already have needs identified that have been prioritized for spending your limited resources on. So having a collection policy, even doing a collection assessment, whether it's your own internal assessment or bringing in an outside consultant to help with the collection assessment and recommendations, any of that type of documentation can help shore up your position in terms of whether or not you do take something in or whether or not you do shift to a different need or issue that your higher ups may want you to. Another thing to think about that I didn't include here is if the higher ups are incredibly focused on you taking in the collection or digitizing a certain thing, ask them to show you the money, because you are only given so much money to work with throughout the year, which if it's not a lot, it has to go to basic like collection needs and issues. And if they want this particularly shiny thing, they have to pay for it. They have to find the money to pay for it. So sometimes just asking them to how to make that happen and where that money comes from is actually a very important and helpful question. And then final question for us today is, how do I change their minds that I, emphasis was mine, that I am what should be paid first versus technology? So in my work in general, as a professional, as a consultant, is a human first approach. So while we work with stuff, We ourselves are humans. The stuff we work with, the collections were created by humans for the most part, and are being used by or want to be used by humans and engaged with by humans. So while what we do is very item focused on the surface level, it has everything to do with human beings throughout the entirety of the acquisition to use process. So centering that here also then in how we prioritize what we spend our money on, and extrapolating that to institutions, museums, archives, academia, etc., where they choose to put their money in the operating budget reveals what their true priorities are. And they have to be realigned to paying humans first and investing in humans. And for my next bullet point is humans are resources. I mean, that's the whole reason why we have a whole department called human resources, right? It's to manage the resources that are human, knowing that they bring with them opportunities, skills, experience, but if not taken care of, there can be liability, risks, losses, etc. So it is in the organization's best interest to take care of their humans, and part of taking care of them means to be paid appropriately. And unfortunately, many of our organizations need to be reminded of that. Also, technology is a tool. So touching on one of our earlier questions, and you still need somebody qualified to use the tool. So they could get in a fancy scanner or a shiny collections management system, but they are still going to need at least one person who knows what they're doing to use that technology effectively, appropriately, what have you. So that is something sometimes they need to be reminded of, but it's also good for us to keep in mind that, yes, they could spend it on technology, but if they're not spending it on humans first or as much as, then there's not going to be anybody there to use the cool tool that they just got. Sometimes an emphasis on professionalization can help here too, much like the first question, and trying to do some gentle education around what it is that we do and the extensive amount of training and experience and skills we have to bring needs to be reminded for them. Nobody is going to do it for us, unfortunately, so we need to get much better about communicating that to the people who are in charge of the budget and making the decisions about whether or not you get paid appropriately or if they get to buy the cool new toy. Also, make it clear about what they could lose if they don't do a human-centered approach to how they're prioritizing their budget. What does it look like when they lose you or your staff? The business cost of losing staff and the downtime and then having to go through the hiring process. There are costs all throughout where it would just be much cheaper actually in the long run to pay people what they're worth versus risk losing them and having the cost of losing and having to find a replacement. So while some management and organizations will not appreciate this particular discussion point, that does not mean it's not a valid discussion point. And in fact, it's one of like the primary business case points to make in situations like this. So similar to some of the advice I gave in the webinar earlier today, is these are all talking points that are incredibly reasonable, and quite honestly, many of them are very obvious, except it's gotten so messed up in who makes the budget, how they make the budget, etc., that unfortunately it is incumbent upon us to do that advocating and to do that reminding of what is of primary importance and how we should really be prioritizing. So hopefully that is all very helpful for you all. Thank you so much for your great questions at today's webinar, and we'll see you around next time.